Why did God choose a Moabite? A people once cursed, forbidden from entering his assembly. Why a poor widow without husband, without child, without a future? Why not a prophetess? Someone from a holy bloodline? Why? Ruth. Have you ever heard her name in the book of Ruth? Welcome to Prayer Station. But did you know her name was engraved into the lineage of Christ? Why would a foreign woman become the great-grandmother of David? And from her blood, Jesus would be born. Could it be that God's grace doesn't chase bloodlines but follows faithful hearts? If so, what does that mean for you? The wounded one, the one left behind, the one never called by name. Maybe. The story of Ruth ain't just a biblical anecdote, but a mirror held up to the soul of anyone who thought they weren't qualified to be used. But before Ruth was written into the line of kings, she walked a path of loss, rejection, and faith without guarantees. She didn't enter history through miracles. She entered with empty hands, unwavering loyalty, and a vow made in the dust. And to understand why that story reaches the edges of grace, we must return to where it began, to the house of bread, where there was no more bread, Bethlehem. It sounds like a holy place, but that name, House of Bread, now echoes like mockery, because that house had no bread left, cracked soil, withered fields. The sound of hungry children was replaced by gut-wrenching sighs. The famine didn't just steal grain, it stole faith. It broke the backbone of those who once believed in heaven's provision. And people began to ask, quietly, but with aching hearts, where is God? If he truly reigns, why must we leave the land of promise just to survive in the land of curse? Are there still miracles, or are we just remnants of a forgotten covenant? Elimelech, a Jewish man, couldn't wait for the answers. He packed everything, his wife Naomi, his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, and they left Bethlehem, once the center of promise, to go to Moab, a cursed land where their ancestors were forbidden from entering the house of God until the 10th generation. A decision, both bold and desperate, not because he stopped believing in God, but because he no longer saw bread. And sometimes people don't reject faith, they just can't endure the silence of the sky. In Moab, Elimelech hoped to find life, but instead, he found a grave, then Mahlon, then Chilion. 3 men, 3 pillars of a family, gone like wind in a foreign land, without legacy, without remembrance. Left behind was Naomi, a widow, in a strange land, no kin, no hope. Only 2 foreign daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. 3 women, 3 lives are no longer protected by law or tradition. From Bethlehem, house of bread, to Moab, land forbidden from the temple. This journey wasn't just migration, it was the exile of a soul. But there are places, even soaked in loss, where God quietly plants the seeds of eternity. Because when all is fallen, when there's nothing left to lean on, God doesn't rebuild what's broken. He begins something new, from ashes. And right there, in the days without bread, Ruth entered the story. Not as an extra, but as the leading role in heaven's redemptive plan. Moab, a land once despised in the eyes of Israel, now become the resting place of 3 graves. No grand funerals, no remembered dates, no promises buried with them. Elimelech, once the leader, was the first to fall. Then Mahlon, then Chilion, 2 sons, 2 hopes for a legacy. One by one, the wind blew, the ashes were scattered, and their names faded into silence. Naomi, a Jewish woman in a foreign land, now had nothing, No husband, no sons, no legacy, no identity, only 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. 2 Moabite women, 2 foreigners, 2 young widows caught between past and future. They were no longer a typical family. There were 3 widows, living quietly together in a land not their own, with nothing left to hope for. Naomi didn't say much, but everyone could see she was empty. Not just empty of tears, but empty of faith. It wasn't that she stopped believing in God, she just couldn't find a reason to believe he still remembered her. Then one day, Naomi heard the news. Bethlehem, house of bread, had bread once again. The Lord had visited his people. Her heart didn't leap for joy. Only a quiet sigh escaped. I will return. Not because she believed something good was waiting, just that the pain in the foreign land had reached its limit. She couldn't remain in Moab, a place where every corner reminded her of what she had lost. Naomi looked at Ruth and Orpah, whom she loved like her daughters, and she said something that sounded harsh, but it was filled with love. Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. I have nothing left to give, no sons for you to marry, no inheritance. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. They embraced, they wept. 3 widows, 3 souls left behind by society, torn between love and reality. Orpah turned back. No one blamed her. She chose a path that made sense, predictable, reasonable. But Ruth did not go. She did not leave. She didn't say goodbye. She simply clung to Naomi. Some people love you while you still carry titles, but they leave when all you have left is the echo of your loss. But then there are others who chooses to stay, not because you have anything left to give, but because they see your worth when you have nothing left to prove. And when Ruth stepped outside her Moabite bloodline, clung to a bitter, empty woman, she wasn't just making a choice. She was making a covenant that would echo into the bloodline of the Messiah. The dusty road back to Bethlehem wasn't long, but for Ruth, it was a journey that cut ties with everything she once knew. Naomi had said, "Turn back, my daughter. I have nothing left to give. I can't bear more sons. Even if I could, how long would you wait?" She spoke like someone who had lost everything, not just possessions, but any reason for someone to stay with her. Orpah wept, then walked away. No one blamed her. She chose the logical path, the one society would understand. But Ruth didn't move, didn't turn, didn't hesitate. Scripture simply says, "But Ruth clung to her." From the original Hebrew, dabak, meaning to stick, like skin to flesh, like bone to sinew, like soul to soul. Ruth, a foreign woman, did not choose a new family, a predictable future, or a safe life. She chose a broken woman. She chose people who wouldn't welcome her. She chose a God she had only heard of but never experienced. And right there on that dusty road, no temple, no priest, no religious rite, an eternal covenant was made, with just words yet strong enough to reshape history. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if anything but death separates us. That vow wasn't like a promise between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. It rang out like a covenant bell, like a soul offering. She didn't say, "I love you, so I'll stay." She said, "Your God is my God." She didn't just choose a person, she chose the one that the woman believed in. Even though that faith was nearly empty, Ruth didn't know that every faithful step she took across dry, dusty ground that day was stirring heaven into motion. There was no light from the sky. No angel appeared, no audible voice from God. Just two widows, one bitter, one relentless, walking down a road no one wanted. But every step Ruth took, there was a vein of grace breaking through the crust of Israel's soil. Because God doesn't need perfect people to write eternal plans, He just needs a heart that doesn't turn away. And when Naomi turned and looked at Ruth, she said nothing more, because she knew something bigger than reason was now moving inside this Moabite girl. Bethlehem wasn't like the memory in Naomi's heart, because memories always keep everything intact. But reality does not. People saw two weary figures walking through the city gate, one familiar, but no longer the same, and one stranger carrying a silence that stirred the whole town. "Is that Naomi?" the whispers echoed. The woman who once left with her husband and two sons, now returned empty-handed with a Moabite woman walking beside her. No one asked outright, but their eyes said enough. What happened? Naomi didn't hide. She stood tall, but her voice cracked. "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. She renamed herself as if to carve a new identity. A woman left with nothing but loss. She didn't hide her feelings, didn't cover her bitterness, didn't try to repaint her face with the lipstick of religion. Naomi didn't pretend. And in that truth was a beauty no one expected. Because God doesn't rescue souls pretending to be strong. He touches the ones brave enough to be honest in their bitterness. And Ruth, she said nothing. She just walked beside her mother-in-law like a shadow of faithfulness. No need for a title, no need for praise, no need to be understood. She knew she was Moabite. She knew the city's streets. She knew Scripture had written, "No Moabite may enter the assembly." But she stayed anyway. No welcome words, no embracing arms. Because true love doesn't need to be understood, only to be present. And then, a small detail was recorded in Scripture, shortered, quiet, seemingly insignificant. They arrived in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning. An ordinary line, but to heaven nothing is random. Harvest season. A season of reaping, a season of hope, a season of turning after the drought. While Naomi spoke of bitterness, God whispered, "A new season has just begun." No one noticed, but Ruth, the Moabite, unnamed, had stepped into Bethlehem at harvest time. Not early, not late, right when grace was being sown again on this land. And sometimes, all you have is the grace to show up at the right place at the right time. No plan, no guarantee, just walking with a faith not yet fully formed. But that very step leads you into the field, where God has already arranged a divine encounter, not by chance, not by coincidence. Ruth didn't choose the field. God chose it for her. And then, in that very field, she would meet a man who wouldn't just see her effort, but would see her future through the eyes of grace. The sunlight shone down on the barley fields of Bethlehem. The wind passed through golden stalks like a silent symphony rising after seasons of drought. Among the reapers was a woman, bent low, gleaning behind them. No one knew her name, no one called her, no one invited her to be there. But still she came. Ruth, not for recognition, not for grain, but for Naomi, the bitter, dry-hearted mother-in-law who had nearly given up. She came to the field because love needs no reason to sacrifice, and faith, real faith, doesn't need to see before it takes the next step. Under the law of Moses, the poor could glean what was left behind after harvest. No one needed to notice. No one had to reserve anything for her. Just not being turned away was mercy enough. But Ruth didn't know. Her feet were walking on a field heaven had already appointed, and the owner was Boaz, a distant relative of Elimelech, a wealthy man but one who feared the Lord, a man not just with power but with a heart. Boaz came to the field as he usually did. He greeted the workers. "The Lord be with you." What kind of leader greets hired hands with a blessing? And then he saw her. No one said anything. No one introduced her. But his gaze paused, because grace always sees what the world overlooks. "Who is she?" Boaz asked. The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite woman, the one who came back with Naomi. She asked to glean behind the reapers." Boaz didn't ask more, because he had heard of the woman who left her homeland, her idols, everything, just to follow a covenant that had no guarantees. And he approached Ruth, not to interrogate, not to protect his land's reputation, but to offer something the poor never expect: care. "My daughter, do not glean in another field. Don't leave here. I've told the young men not to touch you, and when you're thirsty, drink from what they've drawn." Ruth bowed, astonished. "Why have I found favor in your eyes, a foreigner like me?" Boaz replied, "I've heard everything you've done for your mother-in-law. May the Lord repay you, and may you be richly rewarded, you who have come to take refuge under his wings." And then Boaz invited her to eat. With his own hands he offered bread, roasted grain, and water. No royal table, no ceremony, just a cloth on the ground, and the heart of a man who saw worth through heaven's eyes. After the meal, he told the workers, "Let her glean among the sheaves. Leave some on purpose, don't rebuke her. Grace doesn't just allow you to survive, it leaves something behind for you, even when you have no right to ask." Evening came. Ruth returned home. Her hands are full of grain. Her clothes were heavy with provisions. But her heart was heavier with a question. Why was I shown such kindness? Naomi, the one who had renamed herself Mara, saw Ruth return with an entire harvest on her shoulders. She could hardly believe her eyes. "Who showed you such favor?" she asked, trembling. Ruth answered, "His name is Boaz." Naomi froze, then spoke like someone waking from a long night. "That man is our kinsman-redeemer." A sliver of light pierced the long darkness, not through angels, not through miracles, but through a simple meal, a look without judgment, and a man who kept the law but lived by mercy. Boaz didn't know. That day he left grain behind for a Moabite gleaner. It was the day he laid the foundation for the birth of the Messiah. And Ruth? She didn't know that the bundles on her back that day were only the first signs of a far greater harvest to come, the harvest of redemption. When a harvest season ends, people usually exhale and rest. But for Naomi, the harvest didn't just bring grain, it opened up a possibility, a slim opportunity but full of potential. Boaz, the kinsman-redeemer. She looked at Ruth, the Moabite girl who followed her from Moab with no promise, no guarantee. And in those aging eyes, for the first time in many long days, a glimmer of something appeared again, a spark called hope. "My daughter, shall I not seek a place of rest for you?" Naomi said. "Boaz is our relative. Tonight he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor." And then Naomi suggested a plan. Strange, bold, but not reckless. She didn't tell Ruth to seduce. She didn't tell her to manipulate. She told her to go, someone with the right to be redeemed. Wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes. Then after Boaz has eaten and lain down near the grain pile, go uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. In ancient culture, to uncover the feet and lie down was not an act of lust, but a formal plea. Spread your garment over me, for you are a redeemer. It was a request for covering, a plea for covenant, the cry of a soul asking to be grafted into a bloodline not their own. Ruth didn't protest. She didn't say, I'm still young. She didn't say, I'm a foreigner. She didn't say, what if he doesn't want me? She simply replied, I will do all that you say. And that night, she went. No one saw, no one walked her there. Just her, the dark, and a vow carved into her soul. Your God shall be my God. In the middle of the night, Boaz lay asleep after a long day's work, unaware that a piece of eternity's plan was drawing near, soft as the breeze. Ruth arrived. She uncovered his feet, and she lay there, not calling out, not waking him, just waiting, like a humble soul beneath the shadow of grace. At midnight, Boaz stirred. Who are you? He asked, startled. Ruth's voice rang out, quiet but steady. I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your garment over me. For you are a redeemer. Boaz didn't scold. He didn't shame. He didn't question. Instead, he called her something precious. My daughter, your kindness now is even greater than at the first. He was moved, not by beauty, not by courage, but because Ruth didn't chase young men. She chose to uphold the legacy of the dead. Everyone in the town knows you are a virtuous woman. Then Boaz told the truth. There is a redeemer nearer than I. If he redeems you, good. But if not, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. No empty promises, no shortcuts around the law. Boaz, like a foreshadowing of Christ, placed mercy inside justice. Before dawn, he sent Ruth home to protect her dignity. And he poured 6 measures of barley into her cloak as a sign. You will not return empty-handed. Ruth returned to Naomi. She didn't ask for details. She just smiled, because she knew. That man will not rest until he has finished this thing today. Some encounters change emotions. Some encounters change status. But the meeting between Ruth and Boaz, it was an encounter that changed the bloodline of humanity. No one in the field knew what happened that night. No one in the city knew the hand of Boaz was preparing an everlasting covenant. But in the place no one saw, God marked that night as the night grace rewrote history. And as the sun rose, Boaz would walk out, not as a lover, but as a righteous man preparing to fulfill his vow at the city gate. When the sun had just risen over the rooftops of Bethlehem, Boaz was ready. No longer just a landowner, no longer just a wealthy man, but a man who keeps his word. He did not delay. He didn't need to be reminded. He didn't need another sign to be moved. Because those who belong to the covenant don't wait for feelings to do what is right. Boaz went to the place where honor is weighed, the city gate. The city gate, where elders sit to judge, where all transactions, promises, and legal confirmations take place. There are no secrets here, no place for deceit, only the light of truth. Boaz sat down. 10 elders were invited to witness. And then, the closer redeemer, the relative closest to Elimelech, happened to pass by. Unaware, he was walking right into a divine test. Boaz called out, "Hey there, come over, sit here." In the presence of the community, Boaz said, "Naomi, the one who returned from the land of Moab, is selling the land belonging to her husband, Elimelech. You are the kinsman-redeemer, if you redeem it before everyone else." The man nodded immediately. Land, rights, status. Who would refuse such a reasonable opportunity? But Boaz wasn't finished. He continued, "On the day you redeem the land, you must also marry Ruth, the Moabite woman, the widow of the deceased, to preserve the name and inheritance of the dead." Silence fell, not because Boaz was wrong, but because he had just added a condition not easily embraced by the world. Marry a Moabite, a people cursed. People may redeem land, but redeeming a person, especially an outsider, is a different story. The man stepped back. His face changed. Then he said, "I cannot redeem lest I harm my estate. You redeem it in my place." And according to the law, to finalize the refusal of redemption, the man took off his sandal and handed it to Boaz, a simple gesture but full of authority. Amid the community, no secrecy, no shame, Boaz stood up and declared, "Today you are witnesses. I have acquired all that belonged to Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, and I have taken Ruth, the Moabite woman, as my wife, to preserve the name of the dead in his inheritance." No one objected. No one whispered. The elders and the people all responded, "May the Lord make this woman who has come into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May your lineage be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." They did not mention Ruth's Moabite origin as a shame. They did not reject her past. They grafted her name into the history of redemption. Ruth, who once gleaned in the fields, now was publicly declared the wife of a righteous man. Not in the shadows, not in whispers, but in full view of everyone. Boaz didn't just keep his word. He did so openly, with integrity and with full honor. Because true love is not secretive. True grace doesn't need to hide. And true covenant always has witnesses, light, and blessings. Ruth, once forbidden from entering the assembly, now not only entered, but became the matriarch of a royal anointed lineage. And from the covenant made at that city gate, a child would be born. Not the child of a random romance, but the result of a holy redemption. No trumpets, no lavish wedding, no procession, no white dress. But there in the heart of Bethlehem, a marriage was established not by tradition but by covenant. Boaz married Ruth, a Jew choosing to marry a Moabite, a man of honor choosing to bind himself to someone once seen as outside the circle, a man with rights choosing to redeem someone who had none. And the Bible records a simple sentence: Boaz took Ruth as his wife. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. No angels announced it, no brilliant star in the sky, no holy naming ceremony, just a mother holding her child, and a grandmother, Naomi, tending the season she thought she had forever missed. Naomi, the one who once called herself Mara, she was now holding in her arms the result of faithfulness. She didn't give birth to this child, but he was the answer to a prayer that had been shattered back in Moab. The women of the village said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord who has not left you without a kinsman-redeemer. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." 7 sons. That's the symbol of fullness in Jewish society. But they said Ruth, the foreign woman, it's better than 7 sons. The child was named Obed, meaning servant. Not ruler, not conqueror, but servant. And Obed would become the father of Jesse. Jesse would be the father of David, the anointed king. and from the bloodline of David would come another king, the King of Kings. Who would have thought that in the fields of Moab, where Ruth once buried her husband, it would be the beginning point of a redemptive bloodline? No one would have guessed that the woman was once forbidden from the assembly would have her name written into the genealogy of Jesus. If Ruth, a Moabite, one who was once not accepted, a woman who quietly gleaned in someone else's field, if she could become the matriarch of Christ, then you, the one who feels lost in the world, the one who thinks you're not good enough, wrong place, wrong people, wrong time, you may be the one heaven is choosing to write into his story. Because with God, no bloodline is stronger than faith, no resume matters more than loyalty, and no one is an outsider when grace called their name. Ruth is not just a beautiful story in the Bible. She is a living declaration that grace is not bound by bloodline, not limited by ethnicity, and not blocked by the past. She wasn't born into the covenant, didn't grow up under the promise, didn't belong to the people of Israel. She came from Moab, a land once cursed in the law. No Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. But Ruth didn't wait for the 10th. She didn't ask permission from the past to step into the future. She simply grafted her soul to a covenant and walked by a faith no one taught. But God saw. Someone once said, the gospel didn't begin in Matthew. It was already whispering through Ruth. Because in Ruth, we see someone who didn't belong, chosen, loved, redeemed, and became the matriarch of the one who would redeem the world. Ruth is a prophetic image of the church, not from Judah. No Levitical lineage, no priesthood, no perfect law-keeping. But the church was redeemed, not by bloodline, but by a love crucified on a cross. Boaz wasn't just a righteous man, he was a shadow of Jesus. The one with the right to redeem by law. The one willing to redeem without reluctance. The one who upheld the law with honor publicly and transparently. The one who gave before officially receiving. Those 6 measures of barley were proof of overflowing grace. Boaz owed Ruth nothing, but he chose to love. Just Christ chose to love a church once called foreigners without hope, far from the covenant. Ruth didn't come as a perfect bride. She came with empty hands, a heart full of scars, and a faith no one applauded. But grace doesn't require you to be clean before it embraces you. It embraces you to make you clean. And when the child named Obed was born, the whole village rejoiced. Not just because Naomi had a grandchild, not just because Ruth was honored, but because the plan of God took another step forward. Through someone no one expected to be used. Ruth didn't seek to be seen. She was simply faithful, and that was enough for God to engrave her name into eternal history. So if you've ever thought, I don't belong, I'm not clean enough, I have nothing to offer, look at Ruth and believe he is still writing stories like hers, not starting at the throne, but in the gleaning field, not through the temple, but through a heart that doesn't walk away. There are stories in the Bible that doesn't need wonders, don't need miracles, don't need enemies to be defeated by sword or spear. They move us with a glance, a vow, a hand embracing a bitter mother-in-law, a step that doesn't leave the harvest field. Ruth is one of those stories. She didn't preach like Paul, didn't perform miracles like Elijah, didn't sing praises like David. But her life is a wordless song whose melody echoes to Matthew chapter 1, where an angel tells Joseph about a child soon to be born, From the line of David, I used to think God only used the strong, the influential, the thoroughly trained. But then I met Ruth, a widowed woman, a foreigner, someone with nothing but faithfulness. And I realized God doesn't need me to become someone great. He just needs me to be faithful where others walk away. The story of Ruth doesn't just show that God loves the lowly. It proves He uses the lowly to do what no one dares to dream. And if God could do that with Ruth, maybe He also wants to do that with you. If you've walked with us through this whole journey, maybe you're not just someone listening to a story, maybe you are Ruth. Not someone born of holy blood, not someone with a flawless spiritual resume. Maybe you come from Moab, from a place everyone says is not qualified. Maybe you once stood outside the congregation, once dared not look toward the table of grace, thinking there was no seat for you there. But Ruth tells you this: you don't need to be born from the right line to be written into the right story. You just need a heart that won't turn back and a faith that dares to step forward. Even when ahead lies a foreign field, a foreign city, a future with no name, she didn't start with thunder, she started with a quiet decision between dust and the tears of a bitter mother-in-law. And from that decision, a redemptive bloodline was born. Do you know? All of heaven might be holding its breath, waiting to see what will you do in this very moment. You don't have to be good enough. You don't have to be put together. You don't have to look like someone at church. You just have to not turn away. You just have to say, even though nothing is certain, I will walk as Ruth walked. Are you willing to have your name written into the open scroll of grace? You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be known. You just need to be seen by the one who sees you in the field no one else notices. If you feel like God is calling your name, drop a line in the comments below as your declaration, not for anyone else, but for your soul. Maybe it's just one sentence: I choose to walk like Ruth, or a verse from the book of Ruth that moved you. Because sometimes a small public word, it is the first sign of an eternal covenant. And if this story awakened you, share the video so another Ruth out there will know. They are not forgotten. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss faith journeys like this. Whispers from the Bible, calls from eternity, told in a voice meant just for your soul. This is Prayer Station, where the Word of God is not just preached but lived, where ancient stories become a new lifeline for today's generation. See you again. On the next journey, it might be Elijah, it might be Job, it might be you. Because grace is still writing.